During the late 1940s, the communist armies moved out of their bases in northern China and advanced towards the capital. Finally, in January 1949, they entered Peking. They defeated their nationalist enemies and reunited China after years of turmoil. The man who led the communists to victory was Mao Zedong. In reuniting this vast country, Mao combined strategic brilliance with remarkable political skill. Only a relatively small number of men in history had managed to achieve the same feat. But one of them, 1,300 years earlier, had been a high-ranking general named Yang Jian, who usurped the throne of the state of Zhou in North China, changing its name to Sui and proclaiming himself emperor. Eight years later, the Sui conquered their southern neighbor, the Chun, and China was once again united politically for the first time in almost 3 centuries. What is sometimes known as China's Second Empire had begun. The impact of the Sui dynasty on the subsequent development of Chinese civilization was enormous. Economically, their greatest achievement was the construction of a system of grand canals, which served to bring the produce of the rich agricultural lands of the south within easy reach of the government and the army, which were both based primarily in the north. By 609, when the system was completed, the government was able to collect its revenues in grain and move them in bulk to supply the huge standing armies defending the recently refortified Great Wall on the northern frontier. Although altered and repaired many times subsequently, some of those canals, such as this one on the Yangtze Delta, are still in use today. Politically, the Sui made their mark by establishing sophisticated administrative and legal systems. The imperial dynasty, from the first, took pains to recruit Confucian scholars into the government. It also encouraged Confucian learning, a conservative philosophy that emphasized the advantages of education, order, and moral persuasion, and it revived the Confucian-orientated civil service examination system. This system, and the cultured bureaucrats it produced, were to be 2 of the distinguishing features of Chinese civilization for the next 1,300 years. Like others before and after them in Chinese history, the Sui learned that while you can conquer China on horseback, you cannot rule it on horseback. Unfortunately, there were other lessons they did not learn. Flushed with his dynasty's initial success, the second Sui emperor, who came to the throne in 604, tried to accomplish too much too soon. Canal, road, and other construction projects exhausted the people, while Sui armies were ordered to expand the state's frontiers in several directions at once. Following a series of defeats in the north, support for the dynasty crumbled. The emperor was assassinated in 618, and the Sui came to an ignominious end. After almost a decade of civil war, supreme power was seized by another northern noble family, the Tang. The chief figure in the foundation of the dynasty was the second Tang emperor, Taizong, who reigned from 626 to 649. Taizong began by restoring the uniform administrative system of the Sui and by repairing the roads that radiated from the capital. He restored peace, stability, and prosperity to all of China. But Taizong, who has long been considered one of the greatest rulers in Chinese history, also resumed the expansionist policies of his Sui predecessors. Before long, Chinese armies had intervened in India, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, and had established protectorates in Sogdiana, Fergana, and eastern Persia. Direct Chinese political influence would never extend so far to the west again. Indeed, it's been argued that the Tang overextended themselves, and that it was for this reason that they were soon under pressure from various neighbors. Korea easily shook off Chinese rule, and in the north the nomadic peoples from the steppes mounted increasingly heavy assaults on the Tang defenses. Then, in the early 8th century, the newly unified and increasingly warlike Kingdom of Tibet launched numerous attacks against the Chinese Empire. By the year 750, more than 500,000 men were serving in Tang frontier commands under generals who also wielded extensive economic and administrative powers. It was still not enough. In 751, a major Chinese army was routed by the forces of Islam at the Talas River. In 755, one of the frontier generals, An Lushan, marched on the capital, Chang'an, which he captured in the following year. Although the rebel leader was assassinated in 757, the revolt which he began lasted for several years and devastated huge areas of north-central China. The government finally managed to restore order in 763, but it was forced to pay a heavy price. At home, wide powers had to be delegated to local commanders in order to win their support. Abroad, the Chinese withdrawal from the far west continued. The Tibetans expanded to fill the vacuum and were soon within 100 miles of the Tang capital, Chang'an. They were only kept at bay through an alliance with the northern nomads, known as the Uyghurs, shown here paying homage to a Tang general. The golden age of the Tang had come to an end. Even so, the dynasty survived for another 150 years and remained one of the political and economic wonders of the medieval world. Perhaps nowhere in China was more wonderful than Chang'an, which for most of this period ranked as the greatest city on earth. Sadly, little of this remarkable city, which was laid out on a symmetrical grid pattern, has survived. Today, the modern city of Xi'an stands on the site of Chang'an. Chang'an grew by leaps and bounds during the 7th century. By the 8th century, there may have been 1 million people living inside the city's walls, with another 1 million in the metropolitan area around it. By contrast, the population of London at this time was less than 10,000. The vast majority of Chang'an's residents were, of course, Chinese, but there was a sizable foreign community as well. Indians, Persians, Turks, Japanese, and Central Asians jostled each other in the markets of the cities and helped to give Tang China an amazingly cosmopolitan character. This was reflected in the painting and the literature, the architecture and the music, and even the fashionable dress of the day. Pre-modern China would never again be open to such a wide variety of foreign cultural influences. The most important of these influences was undoubtedly Buddhism, which came to China from India in the 1st century AD. Gradually it became more Chinese in character, until by the 6th century, Buddhism had become the dominant religion in the empire and was supported by both the Sui and the Tang, in part because they believed it would prove a unifying factor, knitting together the various subcultures which had grown up in their dominions. The hopes that the early Tang emperors had for Buddhism were fully realized. All over the empire, pagodas and temple complexes sprang up, and visitors from afar would be reassured to find the temple bells rung and the sutras chanted in the capital just as they were at home. Today, after the revolution, Buddhism in China is experiencing a modest revival. Although very little Tang Buddhist architecture remains in China today, at least some idea of its splendor can be gained from these magnificent temples in Japan, all of which date from approximately the same period. Japan, like Korea, was heavily influenced by China, and particularly by Chinese Buddhism during this period. And Japanese artists and craftsmen faithfully copied, and in some cases even surpassed, the work of their continental counterparts. Naturally, Buddhist influence was not confined to art and architecture. Thanks to the tax and other privileges granted by the state, some Buddhist temples became powerful landowners, operated pawn shops and other money-lending institutions, organized famine relief, carried out public works projects, and took an active interest in education. Although a larger structure once existed in the Tang city of Loyang, this building, the great Buddha Hall of the Todai Temple in the old Japanese imperial capital Nara, is now the largest wooden building in the world. The gigantic bronze Buddha it contains was consecrated in 752. It's over 53 feet high and weighs 452 tons, making it the largest bronze statue in the world. Buddhism was closely associated with the development of woodblock printing in China, and thus helped to make the country one of the most literate of all pre-modern societies. This book, a Buddhist sutra in Chinese, has been dated to 868 and is the oldest surviving printed book in the world. However, the Diamond Sutra, as it's known, was printed when Buddhist influence in China was already on the wane. In 843, a Tang emperor, envious of the wealth of the great temples, tried to suppress the faith altogether. Over the next few years, 40,000 Buddhist shrines and temples were closed. 260,000 monks and nuns were returned to lay life, and huge tracts of monastic land were confiscated and sold. Although the suppression itself was short-lived, it was a blow from which the Buddhist church in China never recovered. Never again would any religion occupy such a central place in Chinese life. But at least Buddhism survived. The Tang dynasty did not. A combination of border wars, climatic disasters, and devastating epidemics led to revolts which caused even greater destruction and left the emperor a mere puppet in the hands of warlords who controlled northern China. The Tang finally fell in 907. There ensued more than half a century of political disunion, in which a series of military regimes dominated the north of the country, while the south was divided among several smaller states. Finally, in the late 10th century, one of the northern dynasties, the Sung, reunited most of the empire again. The Sung leaders, like Taizu, inherited a far different country from that which had submitted to their Sui and Tang predecessors. Indeed, during the 10th century, China was in the midst of a sweeping economic transformation which would affect the country up to the present. In the middle of the Tang period, for example, that is around 950, there were probably about 60 million Chinese, more than half of whom lived in North China. But by 1100, the population was well over 110 million, two-thirds of whom lived in central and southern China. This massive movement of people began the economic dominance of the Yangtze Valley and South China, which persists to this day. To feed these extra millions required major advances in agricultural technology, the construction of thousands of new irrigation networks, and the sophisticated use of new and faster maturing strains of rice. It was the resulting sharp increase in agricultural productivity that made possible the very substantial population growth of Tang and Sung times. Industry boomed in Sung China as well, and cities began to break away from the more tightly circumscribed administrative roles of earlier times. The early Sung capital of Kaifeng, pictured here in this magnificent hand scroll of the early 12th century, was the first great commercial capital of a major Chinese dynasty, and was deliberately chosen as such. Kaifeng had not been selected like earlier capitals for historical associations or strategic importance. As this scroll reveals, cities like Kaifeng became busy hives of commercial activity, as trade and industry became an increasingly important source of Sung government revenues. Merchants and artisans, once deliberately depressed in status, began to play a more visible and significant role in Chinese cultural life. Important changes were taking place in the way China was governed as well. By the Sung period, the state had come to rely almost totally on bureaucrats selected by the famous examinations, held in halls like this one. Trained in a revitalized Confucianism, which prized education and was committed to public service, these bureaucrats helped to spread elite values throughout society more thoroughly than ever before in Chinese history. Artistically, this fact is reflected in the gradual turning away from more exotic themes and a reaffirmation of old Chinese ways and methods. Many scholars believe, for example, that it was during the Sung that the venerable tradition of Chinese landscape painting reached its height. At the same time that Chinese painters were creating these masterpieces, their fellow citizens were building schools, writing histories, studying classics, collecting antiques, and exploring their country's past with a skill and enthusiasm which would be unknown in other parts of the world for some time to come. During the 11th and 12th centuries, then, Sung China was probably the richest, best governed, and most cultured state on earth. This doesn't mean, however, that it faced no problems. From the very beginning of the dynasty, for example, the Sung were confronted by the hostile Liao dynasty on their northern frontier, which, despite the maintenance of a huge standing army, they were unable to dislodge from territories that had formerly been Chinese. Indeed, the Sung even agreed to pay indemnities to the Liao to keep the peace. Then, in the early 12th century, they tried to end this humiliation by entering into an alliance with another northern state, the Qin dynasty of Manchuria. The Qin duly helped to destroy the Liao, but then turned on the Sung and overran most of northern China. In 1126, they took Kaifeng and forced the Sung to regroup around Hangzhou, far to the south. The Sung never regained their lost territory, a fact which helped to intensify the feelings of xenophobia that had been growing since the 9th century. By 1200, China was a nation on the defensive, both militarily and psychologically. Even reduced to 2/3 of its former size, however, the southern Sung remained a formidable economic and political power. They still controlled the richest parts of the old empire, and despite military burdens which would have crushed lesser states, trade and industry flourished, and great works of literature and philosophy were still studied and written. Hangzhou, with its beautiful West Lake, quickly replaced Kaifeng as the greatest city in East Asia, if not the world. Yet even as the pleasure craft were gliding back and forth across West Lake in the early 13th century, things were happening elsewhere in Asia which would change the course of Chinese history. For the residents of Hangzhou, as for many other peoples from Japan to Eastern Europe, the Mongols were coming.